Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Friday morning at 10 series. This is Core Virtual Practices. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we get started, we have a couple of announcements, and these are the same announcements that we've had every week. The first is our norms on Zoom. I'm sure you're all familiar with muting your audio and video, and we ask that you do ensure that the entire time that you are muted, both audio and video. We do encourage that you have the chat open. So if you look at your screen and you put your mouse on the bottom of the screen, you'll notice that there is a chat window that you can open. And so we encourage everyone right now to say hi in the chat. Let us know who you are and where you're from. And that way we can get to know you just a little bit better. So welcome all. You can also send private messages through that. So if there's a particular person that you'd like to reach out to, you can do that by clicking in the bottom. It says to everyone, and you can change that and search for someone's specific name if you have something to talk to them about. Feel free to navigate there now and introduce yourself. I see some people are already saying hi. As you know, the public chat, as well as the PowerPoints from Dory, Andrea, and Charlotte today, and the recording of the webinar will be available on our website. If you go to mafla.org and click the resources tab and find PD online, it's the first option. You can access all of these later. We get the stuff up really quick, so maybe even this weekend or Monday or Tuesday, you can go back in and dig deeper. These presentations do go fairly quickly because they're only about 25 minutes. And so definitely take a note of what time it is so that you can go back later and see what you need to. Next, there will be an evaluation posted in the chat towards the end of our hour together. We do hope that you'll fill it out and let us know how we're doing and know how else we can support our members during this time. Obviously, these are unprecedented times and we're really looking to support our members. Speaking of which, we're really excited that there's a lot of people here from Massachusetts that are our members and have learned about this through our e-blasts. If you're not a member, we welcome you here and we're excited to have you. And definitely let us know where you're from in the chat. And we do offer that you could become a member of MAFLA. You can email membership@mafla.org for more information. And we have a great introductory offer there. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our presenters today. So first up this morning, we have Charlotte Gifford, former MAFLA president and currently working at the university level. And then we also have Dory and Andrea, who come to us from Glastonbury Public Schools. You might recognize Dory's name from some texts that have come out about intercultural competencies with Manuela Wagner and Michael Byram. And we're really excited to have them as well today. So Charlotte, would you wave so everyone can see you? And,
hi, everybody.
And Andrea, would you wave as well? Awesome, great. So we are all gonna go on no audio, no video, except for Charlotte, who's going to take it away. Thanks, Charlotte.
Okay, let me just share my screen here. And, oh, one sec more. Share screen, there we go. All right, I think we're in now. Are we in? Okay. I'm going to invite us to take a step backward, as it were, today. And I'm looking primarily through the lens of backward design, because I have found in these 40 years of teaching, yes, I'm celebrating 40 years anniversary this spring, it is for me the key organizing principle for behind planning and teaching for proficiency, for successful teaching and learning. I've been preaching the BD gospel for years now, and I hope today to give you some illustrations, some review of the principles of it, but also some illustrations of how it's been working for me as I transition to a fully online setup. So what is BD? What is backward design? And I'm going to stress here backward, not backwards design. In backward planning, also called backward design, the teacher, the instructor, plans a unit or lesson by first identifying the desired end task or product, then working in reverse to identify the prerequisite learning tasks and benchmark assessments. That quote is from the glossary of the Annenberg videos and their website. Still a very good resource. All right, let's just check the 3 core principles of backward design. This is in the terminology of Wiggins and McTighe, some of our gurus. Their language is step one, identify desired results. It's a little technical. So in my mind, I think of it rather as what should students know and be able to do? One of our mantras, right? Then Wiggins-McTighe tell us to determine acceptable evidence, that is evidence of student learning. How can students show me what they can do? And third, and only in the third place, is the idea of planning learning experiences and instructions. That is, what will it look like in the classroom? What are the best practices to get the results that I want from my instruction? Okay, so I'm going to reword those again. What does that mean for us? The first means that we need sequenced, realistic, and attainable learning goals. And I want to stress the attainable, because if we set ourselves goals that are not attainable, we are setting ourselves up for failure, and nobody needs that, right? The second one is that we need to develop performance assessments that address specifically those goals. They must be aimed at the specific goals we have for our learners. And thirdly, we need to be thinking in terms of teaching and learning that aims for performance, that will let us get the results that we want. Okay? Now, again, just to underscore, we need learning goals. Your system may not call them goals, they might call them objectives, they might call them, there are a bunch of different words for them. But whatever it is, we need to know what we're aiming for. We need those performance assessments, and we need to pay attention to the teaching and learning that aims for it. Okay? Now, I will admit that initially, this concept, this cold backward design concept, was a really hard for me. As a younger teacher at the time, I had a really hard time wrapping my head around it. And it felt pretty crazy to me. I found myself wondering, why do we need these goals, objectives, targets? In the words of the immortal Yogi Berra, if you don't know where you're going to end up someplace else. Okay, nobody sets off on a trip without knowing what their destination is, unless you're going for the sake of a road trip, perhaps. BD to me initially felt, well, really backwards, and I'm adding the S there intentionally because it felt upward, upside down, backwards, all twisted around, okay? I am a teacher to the fiber of my being. As I say, I've been doing this for 40 years, and I had this reaction. Wait, you want me to put my classroom practice last of all? I was persuaded, because in the end, what I came to realize that is really helpful to me and to my department is that it's not a 1, 2, 3 step, it's a cycle. It's a cycle that keeps on going around and around and around. So in Wiggins and McTighe's terminology, there was number 1, number 2, and number 3. But if you close that loop, then it becomes a much more helpful and I believe healthy cycle. And we'll come back to this again towards the end. But this is the nature of our work, I believe, to always know where we're going, to gather evidence about how well we're doing, to apply it to our teaching and learning, and then to check and see again, are we meeting those goals? Are we getting through it? So I guess the question for us today in some really challenging times is why now? I mean, don't we all have a lot on our plates already? And I just want to submit to you that this mantra, keeping the end in mind, is actually going to be one of the best things we can do under trying circumstances. Whether you're trying to hold your classes in sort of a distance ed model where you're meeting synchronously with your students, whether you've moved your whole instruction to online, I believe this is really going to help us and it's worth keeping going with it. Or if you prefer, I will offer you this idea. We can keep calm and keep the end in mind. Keeping calm is certainly important these days. But again, it's a bit of a leap of faith. To me, I've always found that backward design has served me very well, and I believe that it will continue to serve me very well now. So let's take a look at the 3 steps. First of all, as Wiggins and McTighe say, we need to identify our desired results. okay? In my department, we call them performance objectives. They're the goals we have for our students' performance in language. And I just want to contrast what they are and what they are not. First, what they are. They are concrete and observable. They pass what a friend of mine from an elementary school teacher years and years ago told me was the watch me, show me test. When a little kid wants to show you what they can do, they run over and say, Charlotte, watch me, look what I can do. To me, it's like when I was a little kid and I couldn't do the monkey bars and I couldn't go all the way across the monkey bars until finally one day my little arms were strong enough and I wanted everybody on the playground to see me. Okay? In our world, they're often now crafted in I can statements, can do's. And again, because we want them to be realistic and attainable, we have to think in terms of the reality of second language acquisition. Are we setting goals that are actually attainable for our learners? That is, novices should not be addressing advanced level goals, for example. So what are they not? Okay, they are not a set of linguistic structures. They are not the grammar of the language. They are not a corpus of lexical items. They are not the vocabulary of a grammar. And here we come to a really key distinction that I can't stress enough. There are goals and there are tools. And it's not a question of one or the other, it's both and. But we make a huge mistake if we take the tools of language and make them the goals. So let's keep that uppermost in our minds in any case. So curricular goals. Here I want you to just think out to yourselves. We won't be able to do this really out loud because everybody's muted. But if you think in terms of curricular goals, what it is we want our students to know and be able to do, and you check out this list in Group A, we're going to have 3 groups in all. I have here family and friends, to be, to have, briefly describe people, family vocab, ask and answer questions about families. Now, some of these are curricular goals to me, others are not. Some are a third thing. So I suggest as a test that you think in terms of these with the words I can and see what you can do with that. Because if you can insert I can in front of one of these words, that's a curricular goal. If not, it's something else. So let's test this out. I can family and friends. Doesn't make sense in my language. I can to be, to have. Not so much. Aha, I can briefly describe people. That's a good I can statement. Happens to be for novice, but I can briefly describe people is functional, it's realistic, it's attainable. It fits our mantra of a curricular goal. I can family vocabulary, no, not so much. But yes, I can ask and answer questions about family. So basically, to my mind, there's a distinction here between, say, a theme or a topic like family and friends, the tools we need in the 2 languages I teach to be able to do it, and the actual underlying goals that we have. So here are 2 other examples, just briefly. I can talk about my future plans. That works. Okay. I am going to, well, that's a sentence fragment in English, but it's not a goal. And I am a dream vacation doesn't make sense. And finally, if you look at this one, see if you can pick out the I can statements. It's clearly the last item, right? I can ask and answer questions about preferences. But in that context, I'm going to be talking about places and free times. I'll need the tool of to like, to dislike, for example. Okay. Now, when I transitioned to my classes to fully online, you need to know one little bit about me. I did teach fully online in one of my 2 languages, and we found it very challenging. We did continue it for about 3 semesters, and then we transitioned to a hybrid model. So I was fortunate in that I was not totally new to distance learning when COVID-19 hit. So I was a little embarrassed when I realized as I was transitioning my classes, I forgot to post my ICANN statements. That I fixed within a week because I suddenly realized, oh my God, something's missing here. In my normal practice, I would have had these posted on student assignment lists, posted in the classroom. It would have been all over the place. And now in our learning management system, for us, it's Moodle, I didn't even have this list. So one of the first things I did to fix that was to get these up here. And there was an interesting case that came up immediately after that. It was really good that I did so because I had some really anxious students in this transition, students who had never studied online, who had always resisted studying online and still didn't want to be doing it. And so when they started saying to me, I don't know what I should be doing, I was able to say, hey, let's take a look at our can-do statements and take your temperature. Do you feel that you can do some of these things? Do you have partial control over them? So I was really glad that I had them posted, and I encourage you in whatever system you're using, from Google Classroom to Moodle or one of the other LMSs, make sure you have those available for them. Second step in the BD cycle, performance assessment. So I'm going to give you a key reminder here. And from what I'm hearing from colleagues, the assessment question while we're in isolation is varying from school to university to school system all over the place. But here's my key reminder. Call this big circle assessment. All of that is assessment, the biggest pool of all. One subset of assessment is testing, right? All testing is assessment, not all assessment is testing. And then if you drop it down even a smaller bubble, a small segment of testing is standardized testing. That helps a lot of people put it into perspective. And I'm just going to add two other ideas here, especially now that we're online. We've got to be thinking about formative versus summative assessment, even as we did in face-to-face instruction. For example, if your system is telling you, no grades, don't be grading our students right now, it's too much. Maybe you're looking at a lot of formative assessment. Maybe you're talking a lot about feedback and reflection and not grading at all. I'm required to be grading. It's an external reality that I have to face. So I'll be continuing with that as well. Okay, so how will students show what they're able to do? Here's some principles that I think are really important. First of all, any assessment, whether formative or summative, whether formal or informal, for feedback or for a grade, it's got to be linked to that performance objective, to the ICANN statement. It should mirror instructional practice so that it's nothing new to my students. I believe it should always have an incentive to go a step beyond, to level up in terms of proficiency, and it should address all three communicative modes. So those are the four principles for me. Now let's step to the third step in this BD cycle, where Wiggins and McTighe tell us plan learning experiences and instructions. So I've always said to myself, okay, tell me what it will look like in our classrooms. Well, what classrooms? Okay, let's rephrase it. What will it look like in our teaching and learning? Again, whether it be sort of distance learning or fully online learning. These things are not going to go away, folks. We still need exposure to language and context, that is comprehensible input. We need to highlight necessary structures, vocabulary in context, again, targeted input. We need scaffolded language production, that is learner output that keeps on going higher, that keeps on stretching our learners. And we need rehearsal for performance, because whatever we do in instruction should mirror the assessments that are coming. It should really be like a rehearsal of future assessments coming up. Okay, I'm going to give you some cautionary notes here. Lessons learned in my career. First of all, I learned a long time ago in regular instruction, not all games are effective. I like games. I like the words of the immortal Dr. Seuss. These things are fun and fun is good, but not games for the game's sake. They've got to still be fitting into the BD cycle and aiming for my performance objective. They've got to support that learning. So they can't be rote, they can't be mechanical. And I also learned early in my career when the computer-aided instruction was just beginning to take off, not all tech and not all apps are effective either. We don't want to go for tech's sake. And here's the recent application in our current world that I've come across. Not all online activities are effective. I actually had a clue into this when I was teaching fully online. Now I've realized it's true, even when those services are being very generously offered for free, they may not be effective. So I've really got to curate and choose well. Because something is possible doesn't necessarily mean it's desirable. So as an example, a lot of tech applications can end up being like glorified worksheets, and I'm not interested in working with those because they are not linked to my outcomes, to my learning objectives. So let's take a look at some of these. Comprehensible input at I+1, that level of the student, and a little bit more. Look what we can do. We can absolutely help students access authentic documents. Thank goodness this is happening in an age where we have all these resources available. Anything from infographics to YouTube's, perhaps edited up with Edpuzzle, podcasts. I couldn't fit on the screen what we have available to us. And we can also, remember, create recordings or supports that where in a face-to-face model, we might be rendering the comprehensible input more comprehensible. With applications like Jing or Screencast-O-Matic, it's really relatively easy to prepare something and then upload it for students to do when they're able to do it. Okay? This to me is what I finally figured out, notably through my hybrid classes, of an effective way to do a flipped classroom model, where students are doing things before we have the precious semi-face-to-face time. Output. In terms of getting students to produce language, we still need to scaffold it. Their need for support has not gone away. We can help them with strategic support. We can take our postings, what would have been our word walls or our posters, and adapt them for an online use. We can still give students sentence frames or sentence starters or sentence formulas so that they still have that support. We're not going to take that away from them. We can obviously still use graphic organizers. We can use manipulatives. I do that a lot in my face-to-face classes, and I've found that it's relatively familiar to them when I convert that to something like a drag and drop activity. And my LMS, my learning management system, makes that relatively easy. We still need to offer them incentives to level up. And here's my question. Do we do this in all three modes of communication? Because let's be honest, interpersonal communication, that back and forth of language, is the tricky one. Interpretive, that's pretty easy to work online. Presentational, they can present, they can turn work in, whether written or audio, in a presentational format. Interpersonal is harder, right? So I've been having good results so far with online forums. That's a function of Moodle where I can pose a general question and perhaps start the conversation. But I'm finding that 3 phases in an online forum discussion is really helpful, to require everybody to do an initial presentational piece that answers my question, but that everybody have a certain number of required reactions to their peers' content, where they're commenting back and forth and responding to content, and also that they be required to ask follow-up questions. And that means that I, as the original poster, as a student, the person who posted my paragraph first, I now have to go back and answer the questions, because that kicks in the cycle of the interpersonal mode, including potentially negotiation of meaning. So that's all written, admittedly. I'm currently using Zoom for any synchronous portion of my classes, and I am finding that the breakout rooms are a good application for getting more people to talk. I was pretty distressed when I realized initially that, this feels very old school. I'm asking a question and one person answers, and then I'm asking another and another person answers. Now I'm only doing that to model an activity, and they're being sent immediately to their breakout rooms. They need a specific task, and we still need the reporting phase as usual when we come back in. And that is when we come back in. And I believe that in Google Classrooms, there's a way to do that as well. Okay, in closing, because we're running out of time here, I know. The backward design cycle that really does support us has a concept at its heart that I want to leave you with. This is who we are, folks. We are teachers and we specialize in inquiry. We're asking questions of ourselves and our learners. We're asking, is this instruction working? We're asking our learners, can you do this? Can you show me? And we're testing out various different techniques and strategies against our goals and the proof, the evidence in the assessment phase. If you will, we as teachers, we as intellectuals, do this job, this inquiry, as part of our DNA. To me, it is essentially the scientific method for us as teachers. From here, I want to leave it to some question and answer. So Becky, if you can join us again.
Yeah, we do. Yep, we do have one great question here. So someone asked about the sort of the structure, what you put forth, what backward design is this structured piece. And then on the sort of putting that in one hand. And in the other hand, we have this idea that we want to have student creativity and we want to be flexible with how the students are going forward. We want their input, we want their voice. So how do we ensure that we can keep this really classic, beautiful cycle and then at the same time allow for this space and amount of choice and sort of off-script learning?
I think that's a fantastic question, and I'll give you a couple of examples. That what I told you about before about that anxious student, it was the student who came to me in our newly online setting and was saying, Charlotte, I'm not sure you realize how much time I'm putting into this. And I had to say to her, frankly, no, I didn't realize that, but thank you. That started off a cycle for me. At the beginning of classes now, I'm checking in on a couple of things. Are the activities that I'm selecting working for you? And also I'm reiterating that there is choice here. That is, when I set up a bunch of an assignment or homework online, I'm now color coding the things that are must do, and I'm leaving a lot of opportunity and openness for students to explore and figure out of the possible activities to prepare for our next session together, what's working for you. So we take just a moment at the beginning of a session and potentially at the end when I show them what's coming up next to attack that and to say, look, there are options, there are choices here. As I go forward and as I move into a next unit, they're also going to be having some assignments where they go out and find something that is of interest to them, so that it is not just me guessing what they're interested in right now. We've talked quite a bit about COVID-19 in a health and wellness unit right now, but I want to flip it now and think about well-being. So my students are going to be getting assignments to find in target language information on what well-being is to them. And that is still true, I believe, to this cycle that's running in my head. I hope it's pretty similar to what I would do anyway. I think I'm being forced into that application by our current circumstances. If nothing else, at 40 years teaching, I'm still growing.
We have time for one more quick question. This one came about can-do statements. So you mentioned that you post those for your students, whether that's virtually or in the classroom. And so the question came, how do you follow up on those, especially in this virtual world?
That's a really good question. So before I get to, and as I mentioned, I have to be assigning grades still. So before I get to any of my higher stakes assessments, in addition to the informal, can you do this yet? How are you feeling about it? As we prepare for that final end of unit assessment, students will be asked to do a self-assessment Can they do it yet? Those are really easy to do. Ticket out the door is still totally possible in the online world, right? Or they could submit it to you later. And also in terms of the feedback on them, on their work, they're going to be getting some specific next steps based on those. So for example, right now my novices are working hard on being able to do a fuller description of a person. They already learned to do the very basics of tall, short, long hair, short hair. Now it's more about the whole person, a member of their family that they care about. And so I'll be giving them some direct feedback on how successful they were based on those, and targeting those can-do statements where they need more work. In our system, they're totally cumulative. No can-do statement, excuse me, ever goes away. So I'll always be able to say, okay, we're still working on this one, and you need specifically to work on that one. I hope that helps a little bit.
Yes, I think so. Thank you so very much, Charlotte, for this wonderful presentation on backward design. And I think that this is really applicable for now when sometimes we feel like we're going on a minute-by-minute basis, and just being able to take this 20,000-foot view, plan with the end in mind. I think that this could really take some stress off of us. I also want to say, and Charlotte, you alluded to this in the beginning, like sometimes we don't know that we feel comfortable with what the end might be. Some of us know that we're in virtual learning for a while. Some of us don't know if we're going back to school this year. And so sometimes the end feels a little bit cloudy. And so I encourage you to find an end that works for you in this time and for your students in this time, whatever that might be, and start working towards that, even if it's a little bit different than what you anticipated at the beginning.
Becky, I totally agree. And I would just say, set those small interim goals and focus on those. Do what's possible. Don't kill yourselves.
Agreed. Speaking of which, we're going to take our traditional 1 minute here as we transition from Charlotte to Dory and Andrea. So I encourage you to take a moment here to breathe, to get that extra cup of coffee if you need a bio break, and we'll be back in 1 minute with Andrea and Dory. Thank you, Charlotte. Welcome back, everyone. And if you're not quite back, that's okay too. That's why we record these webinars. Again, they're posted on MAFLA's website under the resources tab, online PD, as well as the chat and the presentations from our presenters. Again, we offer the option for you to join MAFLA. You can email membership@mafla.org. And we thank everyone for keeping their audio and their video off during this time. And I'm really excited that my friend Dory agreed to talk to us today about intercultural competencies. And she has a friend, a colleague, Andrea from Glastonbury Public Schools. So take it away, Dory.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here too. And for those of you who know me, this is my absolute favorite topic. So I'm really excited to be here with you all today. So I am going to switch over to our presentation in just a moment. Okay, so as you already know, today we're going to talk about intercultural competence in virtual classrooms. Our goals for today, we have two. Our first goal is I can describe the difference between culture and intercultural competence. That's a question I get a lot when I am presenting. And our second goal here is I can gather ideas to incorporate intercultural competence in my own virtual setting. And we do recognize that all of our own virtual settings do look quite different. So first, just talk a little bit about culture versus intercultural competence. What is the difference? So to start, a lot of times when we think about culture, we think about the actual framework of products, practices, and perspectives. I know a lot of us are kind of familiar with the 3 Ps of culture, as we might call it. And oftentimes when we talk about culture too, we're familiar with this sort of iceberg concept of culture, where we have the visible aspects of culture, like maybe how somebody dresses, just tangible objects that we can see and different artifacts. But we're also aware that underneath the surface, we have these different aspects of culture that we don't always see. And those are generally, when we look back at the actual framework, underneath that water, generally the perspectives. So we think about, like, how does a culture value personal space, or, what is a concept of personal space, for example. So these are, when we think about culture, we often think about these kind of frameworks. I know a lot of times when we teach culture in the classroom, we tend to kind of stop in these visible areas. And we do it in a way that we're often explaining to our students what culture is. So if we think about the classic textbook model, oftentimes in textbooks, you have these like little call out boxes where it says, like, did you know that in X culture, they do Y and Z. And oftentimes we find ourselves doing that in the classroom too. We kind of explain culture to our students. So we look, and in the world of language teaching, there's been this kind of paradigm shift in teaching culture, where if you look at this, this kind of first circle over here, students gain knowledge and understanding of culture. So oftentimes that's where we start off. We say, like, I need to give my students knowledge about this other culture. But then as a profession, we kind of switch to having our students interact in culturally appropriate ways. So for example, we might say, like, okay, it's not enough for my students to just know about Spanish culture. I want my students to actually know that, okay, when you go to Spain, instead of shaking hands, you're going to give a kiss on each cheek. And maybe you practice that in the classroom, or you introduce materials to show them what that might look like. So that way, when they do travel abroad, they know how to act in quote unquote culturally appropriate ways. But now we see in this last circle here, where we're really guiding our students more when we talk about intercultural competence, is students using language to build and maintain relationships. And what I really like about that is I teach in the elementary school. I teach first, second, and third grade. And it's really hard for me to get my students really excited about, like, hey, someday in the way off future, you might go to Spain and you might have to kiss somebody on both cheeks. It's really hard for them to imagine that. But in this last bubble, where I'm asking students to use language to build and maintain relationships, that's something that they can do in first grade. So oftentimes when I talk to my students about why they should learn a new language, it's not someday you'll get a job and you'll have to speak other languages, or someday you're going to travel abroad. I always tell them, the more languages you speak, the more friends you can make, because it's really hard to make a friendship if you don't speak the same language. And intercultural competence allows us to do that, to really build and maintain relationships across language and across different cultures. So that paradigm shift that I just explained is also reflected in our national standards. So if you look on the left side of the screen, this is the culture goal area of our standards, first published in 1996. So you see very clearly here, it says that students are expected to gain knowledge and understanding of other cultures. And if you compare that to the goal area of the 2015 World Readiness Standards, you see that students are expected to interact with cultural competence and understanding. So it's not just this knowledge and understanding, but it's an actual interaction with people. So that's really what we're talking about when we talk about intercultural competence. So a definition here of intercultural competence is the ability to interact with people outside of one's culture based on combination of attitudes, knowledge, and skills through which one demonstrates awareness, sensitivity, curiosity, empathy, and knowledge of the perspectives of others. So when I think about my own students, I would always love my students to act in a way that's more curious or sensitive, to be more empathetic. So that's really what we're talking about. So less again about the knowledge of practices, perspectives, and products, and more about this ability to interact. So oftentimes when I work on incorporating intercultural competence in my classroom, I tend to use Michael Byram's model. So you can see here that Michael Byram, when he talks about intercultural competence, he breaks it down into skills. Skills on the top here, skills of interpreting and relating. And then on the bottom, skills of discovery and interaction. There also is a knowledge component of it. So it's not saying that we don't need to have knowledge. There is a knowledge, but it's a knowledge of self and a knowledge of others and a knowledge of interaction. So individual interactions or kind of societal interactions. And there's also on the right-hand side here, attitudes. So being able to kind of we sometimes say like being able to relativize self, like to decenter and to value other perspectives. So to kind of look at things from another lens, and have these kind of attitudes of like curiosity and openness. And then very symbolically in the middle here is the education, so political education and a critical cultural awareness, which is oftentimes, we also talk about this kind of like engagement piece, what intercultural competence really looks like in action. So all of these pieces here are what we call intercultural competence. And we recognize that all of this can happen without speaking another language. So this all can happen in just English in L1. But when we take those pieces and we add linguistic competence, sociolinguistic competence, and discourse competence in L2, now we're talking about intercultural communicative competence. So we don't want our students to just be able to do these things in L1, we also want them to be able to do them in a second language. We also recognize that, so again, students can do this, just intercultural competence in L1, but we want them to be able to do it with their language proficiency. So this kind of overlap in the middle here, this is where intercultural communicative competence is. What pieces of intercultural competence can they do with the language proficiency that they have? And we recognize that for a lot of our students, their language proficiency might be smaller than the skills they have in intercultural competence. So we want our students to kind of build their language proficiency as they build intercultural competence, and then kind of like move those circles closer together. So we want them to be able to do everything that all their intercultural competence skills, we want them to be able to do that with their language proficiency. So one thing that really helps students move towards intercultural competence, and some of the activities you're going to see that we're going to present for you today are a lot about reflection. So ACTFL, the Necessful ACTFL created an intercultural reflection framework, which is linked on the bottom here, but you can also just Google it. It's an easy way to find it. So Necessful ACTFL Intercultural Reflection Framework. And the framework really is broken down into 3 different pieces. The first is an introductory in-class component in the target language. So you do some type of classroom activity where students are kind of investigating their own culture or investigating another culture or interacting with another culture. And then students are expected to do a deeper reflection outside of class in English. Because remember, all of those intercultural competence skills that they have, they might not be able to do that if they have limited language proficiency. So naturally, that deep reflection is going to happen in L1. Unless you have students that are at the advanced level, if you're lucky enough to have students at a more advanced level, then they can do that deeper reflection in the target language. And we're going to see some examples of what that can look like today. And then after the teacher reads those reflections, you would do a follow-up in-class target language activity. So if you're reading those student reflections and you're realizing like, wow, my students are being really defensive about their own culture, like they're in this kind of like defense stage where they feel very protective of their culture and they're kind of threatened by other cultures. Now as a teacher, I'm going to look at those reflections and say, okay, now what is going to be my next step? Kind of that backwards planning, right? I've recognized that my students are in this defense stage. What am I going to do to help my students move to that next level? So I like this quote here too, below those 3 steps, where it's worth noting that the lack of sufficient language proficiency does not present the internalization of cultural perspectives. It only hinders the ability to communicate them in the target language. So we do need to make sure we're giving students opportunities to reflect further. So that's kind of the introduction of the theoretical piece. I know I kind of rushed through it really quickly because I think the next step of gathering ideas of how you can incorporate this in your own virtual setting is really important. So I'm going to unshare my screen here so that way Andrea can take over and she'll be able to give some examples of how she does this in the classroom.
Great. Thanks, Story. And hello, everyone. I didn't really get a chance to fully introduce myself, but just for the sake of time, I will just go ahead and share my portion of the presentation and hopefully allow some time at the end for some questions that we might be able to answer. So just following along the theoretical piece and contextualizing within our current reality, I thought it would be appropriate to touch a little bit on the use of technology to implement and structure activities and lessons and units and structure curriculum as a whole in a way that would promote the development of intercultural competence. And I think especially now, I mean, and technology has been something that we've always tried to incorporate in our classrooms, but especially now, I think using technology with intentionality is becoming and should be something that we're really critically thinking about. So when it comes to technology, really asking yourself, did I just do this with a purpose in mind? And are we aware that we're using technology with a plan to achieve something great in integrating this tool, whatever tool you choose to integrate? And again, now with the pandemic, there are different tools that are becoming available, and everything seems to be so attractive and everything seems to be so new and innovative that I think a lot of the times we might get lost in these pretty shiny things and may lose sight of the purpose behind why we're choosing to use them. So when I say intentional and to be intentional is to be deliberate, purposeful about why you're using any form of technology in the classroom and with distance learning especially. Hopefully with this presentation, I hope to inspire some self-reflection about the intentionality behind and meaningfulness behind the decisions that you're making in choosing any technology tool in remote learning. So just a little bit, just a bit of a statement that ACT will release about what should the role of technology be. And again, tying it back to our bigger and central goal of world language education, and in using technology or any other resource that we have available to us in a way that will help language learners to use the target language in culturally appropriate ways, and in order to accomplish authentic real world tasks. So I thought this is a time where I can kind of show what I've been doing in my classroom and with remote learning and prior to distance learning. And obviously this is a great jumping off point from the earlier presentation, because I really do believe that a good starting point is to backward design and obviously always to start with good, true, essential questions that lead to performance objectives in which our language objective is contextualized within a cultural component and in a way that you are able to use a variety of different authentic resources. So the learning targets, the daily learning targets that you might choose to implement for every lesson would hopefully lead you to students accomplishing those performance objectives, not just the linguistic part of it, but the cultural part of it, and even beyond the intercultural component of it. So in structuring this entire thing, really asking yourself, how will any technological tool facilitate student learning and language use? And then I will show different ways in which I have structured my classroom with e-learning so that in order to allow for students self-reflection and student feedback. So this is where I'm going to show How I have done this, I teach both at the high school level and at the elementary level. And at the high school level, my classes are sophomore students who have taken the language for 10 years. And they are at an intermediate mid or intermediate high level. And for this curriculum, we focus on Spain. And one of our units is on history. Specifically, we touch on the Spanish Civil War. And so you can see here the essential questions that are relevant to this specific unit. One of the things I really thought about prior to teaching this curriculum was in what ways can I connect my students not only to a past event, but also to a past event outside their own culture? How do I get them to care about something that really, if you think about it, doesn't really concern them, and it might not be part of their own reality. So I thought about incorporating the idea of adversity, which is something that I believe everybody has had some experience with. And this was a great point of connection for them to think about war and to think about political struggles within the context of adversity. And they find it a little bit easier to connect not only to this event, but also to the different effects and repercussions that may come about from political adversity and war. So you can see my performance objective here, and you can see that I use language functions in the way that I structure my performance objective. So saying I can describe or I can explain are measurable performance objectives that you would be able to, at the end of the unit, using a rubric or whatever measuring tool, you would be able to evaluate. But also, I think it's important to contextualize these performance objectives, not just in terms of the cultural facts, but beyond. When thinking about my learning targets, obviously each learning target will be unique for each class. Depending on the level of your students, we teach this curriculum and we teach this unit to students that are at different levels in terms of linguistic ability. So being able to target these goals and keep into consideration your audience is important as well. Authentic resources as well is something that it would be worth really analyzing and really trying to determine the ways in which you can use authentic resources to achieve your performance objectives in ways that students can process. So here is where you can also start to think about how you will integrate the technology. And then obviously the self-reflection, the student feedback is something that really helps bring it all together. So I am going to show you exactly how I do this and how I've been able to guide my students through the developing intercultural competence through e-learning and what this might look like. One of the things that I really choose to do in terms of self-reflection is to construct some sort of platform where students can interact with one another. And again, this idea of interaction, this idea of interpersonal communication takes a whole different meaning when it comes to e-learning. So I structured a plain old Google document in which I present students with a reflection prompt, and I ask them to first post their own response to my reflection prompt, and then I ask them to read 2 other students' prompts and comment on those students' responses. So this is a way that I've been able to allow for collaboration and for students to be able to interact with one another, gain somebody else's perspective, and then base their response on what they've been able to gather. So I just have a few different excerpts about from some of my students and what they reflected. And I did translate some of these for you. So those of you who are not Spanish teachers, you can really kind of get a sense of what they reflected on their own responses. So this was this student's original response to my prompt. And you can see, I think it's great that you can see a lot of the ICC concepts kind of emerging through these reflections. So I really love that she says, and this ties back to what Dory said, right? Inspiring curiosity. We want to understand why or how. And this was one of the responses that this first student received based on her original reflection. Right. I love that she talked about simple ideas of cultures, just, and she references here, and I'm sure she doesn't really fully realize it yet, but she's referencing here just the cultural facts that sometimes we tend to teach and stick to in the world language classroom. And so this is the second response that the first student got as part of her original response. So this awareness of our own culture is something else that can come about from self-reflections. I would argue too that if your students are not familiar with reflecting, it would be worth walking students through how to go about reflecting, because this is not something that they already know how to do on their own. So I do give my students some sort of outline for them, just to guide them how to go about reflecting. And then I do know that we're running out of time, but I think that this is definitely worth mentioning. In terms of intercultural competence and teaching for intercultural competence, a lot of the times this is an idea that we as teachers think that is our responsibility to impose on students. And a lot of the times we don't really realize that the work begins with teachers themselves. I wanted to share with you this conceptual framework that came from one of our colleagues and our head teacher at Glastonbury, her dissertation that she did on intercultural competence and the teacher's role in how teachers play an important part in developing not only students' intercultural competence, but how their own development of intercultural competence comes into play. I would ask that you reflect on your own attitudes, knowledge, and skills as a teacher, and maybe think about your responsibility to be cognizant first of your own intercultural competence. Sarah Lindstrom is the colleague and our head teacher that I previously mentioned. So if I double checked with her that it would be okay for me to share her information if you want to reach out to her. But she developed a measuring tool of sorts that she implemented to conduct her research, and the emphasis on her research was really on practices that she identified that could really help teachers frame their lessons and their curriculum as a whole. So if you are interested in kind of really getting a sense of for what that would look like, I would encourage you to reach out to her. And I don't know that we have time for other examples, but Dory, and Becky, you can step in and just let us know if it's time to just cut it off, because I do think that Dory and I wanted to give you a sense of some examples, but I don't know that we have time to do elementary at this time, but you can let us know.
We are kind of butting up against the 11 o'clock hour, unfortunately, and we do have one question I'd love to throw out to you and Dory. But you do have these beautiful examples on your slideshow, and that presentation is going to be made available on our website. So maybe you could put a little explanation in before we post those, if that's okay with you, and then people can.
Sure. Yeah.
So we have one question so far, which is a lot of students right now, depending on how they're handling the situation, might just be responding to these sorts of things to check a box. They know that they need to do this, and so they want to write something. So in what ways do you ensure that students aren't just kind of checking it off their to-do list, and that their conclusions are meaningful and validating other people's ideas and inspiring curiosity?
Sure. I would say that it also, for me, this is something that you build from day one in your classroom. I think that for me at this point, I have an easier time doing this because this is something that I've implemented from day one. So it definitely, to me, it sounds like it would be a challenge to kind of suddenly incorporate this into your classroom if you haven't done it across the board. Not that it would be impossible to do, but I think it really is something that is a process and it takes time to develop in terms of not just ICC development as a whole, but in terms of creating a learning community in which this is something that is a common goal for all participants. So also, I think developing meaningful tasks in which students are engaged and they find a connection to what they're being asked to do. I think a lot of the times we put a lot of, we kind of think of students as just not being disengaged when the task that we might have asked for them to do is something that really might not be something that interests them to begin with. So really thinking about what it is that you're asking them to do, and how this can be purposeful for their own learning, again, just beyond language skill.
Yeah, and I'll just add very briefly that if there are people who are interested and maybe they haven't incorporated it in the past, one way, an easy in, I think, with students, and something that's often forgotten when we talk about intercultural competence, is the deep reflection of one's own culture. So a lot of times we as language teachers, we think a lot about just the other culture. But I love how Andrea, even in her example, said, okay, what's the hook that's going to get my students to really consider maybe this cultural event that they're not so interested in? So trying to find things, like I loved her example of like, how do I face adversity? In the elementary school, a lot of students, they love to talk about like, it's not fair. So this kind of like concept of fairness. So fairness is an easy way for me to bring in, to have like, to hook my students in. So I would say for people who are just getting started, remember that it's also okay to have students really critically reflect upon their own culture and use that as like a first step to get them to start to critically reflect and look at other cultures.
Awesome. Thank you for those wonderful responses and great presentation. There was a note in the chat that they'd love to be able to see more novice level. So I'm excited to see the end of that presentation when it gets posted on the MAFLA website. Thank you so much to Dory and Andrea. Thank you so much to Charlotte, who was with us earlier on Backward Design. Folks, we are coming to the end of our Friday at 10 a.m. time together with Core Virtual Practices. There is an evaluation in the chat window. We really hope you take a moment to fill it out. There's just a few short questions and none are required. We're looking to support our members in the best way possible here at MAFLA. And so we thank you so much for being here. And we wish you a wonderful weekend. It's beautiful weather today. I'm inspired by Candide, the phrase, for those of you French teachers who have read Voltaire, il faut cultiver son jardin, the idea of like being out and working a little bit with the earth and also finding pleasure in the small things. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you again, presenters, and we'll see you next week. We have Caleb Howard on exclusively target language use in the virtual classroom. And also we have Tim Egan on feedback in the virtual classroom. So we'll see you then. Bye-bye.